The late afternoon sun filtered weakly through the dense canopy of Virginia's wilderness, casting long shadows across the forest floor, where frost still clung to the underbrush, despite the approaching spring. Jake Miller moved through the undergrowth with practiced ease, his weathered hands gathering fallen branches for the evening fire, the smell of damp earth and pine needles filling his lungs with each breath. At 38, his face bore the marks of a man who had seen too much loss too early. Lines etched deeper than his years should allow, gray threading through the dark brown hair at his temples. Behind him, his German Shepherd Rex suddenly froze, ears pricked forward, a low growl rumbling in his chest that made the hair on Jake's arm stand up. Jake turned. Instinct honed from years as a firefighter telling him something was profoundly wrong. The dog's behavior was different from his usual alerts at deer or raccoons. This was fear mixed with urgency. Rex bolted toward a clearing about 50 yards ahead, barking with an intensity that sent ice through Jake's veins. He dropped the firewood and ran, boots pounding against the damp earth, branches whipping at his face. The dog stood over a mound of freshly turned soil, pawing frantically at the ground, dirt flying behind him in desperate arcs. Then Jake saw them. Pale fingers extending from the dark earth like desperate roots reaching for sunlight. The nails broken and caked with dried blood. For a moment, his mind refused to process what he was seeing. Then, training overrode shock. Time collapsed into a single moment of pure terror and purpose. Jake fell to his knees, hands tearing at the cold dirt. Heart hammering against his ribs so hard he thought it might break through. The soil was loose, recently disturbed. And as he dug deeper with movements that became increasingly frantic, his fingers found fabric, then shoulders, then a face covered in mud and streaked with dried blood. He pulled with all his strength, muscles screaming, dragging the limp form from its earthen tomb. A woman, young, barely breathing. Her lips blue and cracked. Skin so pale it looked translucent in the fading light. Her eyes fluttered open for just a second. Unfocused and filled with raw fear that Jake recognized from his worst calls as a firefighter. She tried to speak but only managed a rasping sound that might have been a word or might have been a death rattle. He cleared her airway, checked her pulse, found it thready and weak but present. She was alive. Barely, impossibly, miraculously alive. She was Emily Carter, 29 years old, CEO of Carter Industries. A face that had dominated every news station for the past 48 hours. Missing. Abducted. Presumed dead by most experts. And here she was. Buried alive in the woods less than an hour from Jake's cabin. Pulled from death by a man who had been looking for nothing more than kindling to cook dinner for his 7-year-old daughter. Emily's lips moved again, a whisper so faint Jake had to lean close, his ear nearly touching her mouth to hear over the sound of Rex's continued barking. What she said in that moment would change everything. It would pull him into a web of betrayal and danger he never asked for. Connect two fractured souls across impossible divides, and force both of them to confront truths they had spent years running from. But first, they had to survive the night. Jake Miller had not expected his life to look like this. 5 years ago, he had been a different man entirely, one who believed in plans and futures, and the promise that tomorrow would be better than today. He had been a firefighter in Richmond, respected by his crew for his calm under pressure and his ability to read a burning building like some men read books, devoted to a wife who made him laugh even on the worst days, and a baby girl who had just learned to walk and thought her father hung the moon. Then came the accident, sudden and merciless as a lightning strike. A drunk driver, a rainy highway slick with oil, a car that spun out of control and crossed 3 lanes of traffic. His wife Sarah died on impact. The medical examiner told him later, trying to be kind. She did not suffer. Jake survived without a scratch, walking away from the twisted metal that had been their sedan, and that felt like the cruelest punishment of all. Why had he lived when she had not? What cosmic injustice let him breathe while she lay cold on a morgue table? He quit the fire department 6 months later, unable to bear the weight of saving strangers when he had failed to save the one person who mattered most. The nightmares came regularly. Dreams where he pulled people from burning buildings, only to find Sarah's face behind every mask, her eyes accusing him of choosing everyone else over her. He knew that was not rational, but grief rarely is. His captain had tried to talk him out of leaving, reminded him of his exemplary record, the lives he had saved, the rookie firefighters he had mentored. But Jake could not shake the feeling that his hands, which had carried dozens to safety, had somehow been the ones to kill his wife. He took Lily, not yet 3 years old and asking constantly when mommy was coming home, and moved to the outskirts of the state, to a small cabin on the edge of the woods, where the silence was so complete it felt like drowning. The cabin had belonged to Sarah's grandfather, left to them in a will they had never expected to use. It needed work, had been empty for years, but it was theirs, and it was far from Richmond. Far from memories that ambushed him on every street corner. He took odd jobs to keep them afloat. Handyman work, fixing roofs and clearing trees, sometimes helping at the local hardware store when they needed an extra pair of hands. Enough to pay bills and keep food on the table and cover Lily's needs. Enough to survive, but not enough to live, not in any meaningful way. The work kept his body busy, but his mind remained a prison of what-ifs and if-onlys. Lily was 7 now, bright and curious in ways that sometimes broke his heart, with her mother's green eyes that seemed to see straight through his careful facades and her father's quiet strength that he was not sure he possessed anymore. She asked questions about Sarah sometimes, tentative and gentle, as if afraid the questions themselves might hurt him. He answered as best he could, painting a picture of a woman Lily barely remembered. On good days, he took her fishing in the creek that ran behind their property, teaching her to bait hooks and read the water. On bad days, he stared at the walls and wondered if he was doing any of this right, if Lily would grow up blaming him for the childhood he could not quite give her. The cabin was small but sturdy, built from logs that had weathered decades of storms, surrounded by towering pines that whispered secrets in the wind. Inside, the furniture was simple, worn but clean, most of it salvaged from thrift stores or built by Jake's own hands during the long winter nights. Photographs lined the mantel over the fireplace, frozen moments of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. Sarah laughing at their wedding, Lily as a baby covered in birthday cake, the 3 of them on a beach somewhere warm. Jake could not bring himself to take them down, but looking at them felt like pressing on a bruise that never quite healed. He cooked simple meals, spaghetti and grilled cheese, and occasionally something more ambitious when he had the energy. He helped Lily with homework, marveling at how quickly she learned, how easily math and reading came to her. He read to her before bed, voices for all the characters, making her giggle with silly accents. They lived quietly, carefully, 2 people trying to make sense of a world that had broken them both in different ways. His hands were calloused from work, rope, burn, and splinters, and the rough texture of wood and stone. His body still strong despite the years of not quite taking care of himself the way he should. The scars on his soul ran deeper than any he had earned fighting fires. He carried guilt like a second skin, wore it in the way he held himself, the careful distance he kept from anything that felt too much like hope or happiness or the possibility of moving forward. People in town knew him as the quiet single dad who never caused trouble and never asked for help, who paid his bills on time and kept to himself. They did not know about the nightmares, the nights he woke gasping with smoke in his lungs that was not really there, or the way he still set the table for 3 out of habit before catching himself. Lily was his anchor, the only thing that kept him tethered to the world of the living. For her, he got up every morning, even when his body felt made of lead. For her, he learned to smile again, even when it felt like lying, like wearing a mask of a person he used to be. She deserved better than a broken father in a cabin in the woods, better than this half-life they were living. But she loved him fiercely anyway, with the uncomplicated devotion of children, and that love was both his salvation and his deepest shame. He had no idea that his life was about to collide with someone from a world so far removed from his own that they might as well have been living on different planets, that a simple walk in the woods for firewood would drag him into a nightmare that would test everything he thought he knew about himself. Emily Carter had built an empire before most people figured out what they wanted to do with their lives, before her college classmates had even paid off their student loans. The youngest CEO in Carter Industries' history, she had taken her family's struggling tech company and transformed it into a powerhouse, worth billions, respected and feared in equal measure by competitors and admirers alike. She was brilliant in ways that made others uncomfortable, ruthless when necessary in a world that punished women for the same behaviors it rewarded in men, and utterly, devastatingly alone. Success had cost her everything soft, everything vulnerable, everything that made life worth living beyond spreadsheets and stock prices. Relationships withered under the pressure of constant work. Men who could not handle a woman who earned more and worked harder and cared less about traditional expectations. Friends fell away, unable to compete with deadlines and board meetings and business trips that consumed weeks at a time. Her family, what remained of it, viewed her through the lens of dollar signs and inheritance disputes, saw her not as a person but as an obstacle or an opportunity depending on their needs. Her younger brother, Daniel Carter, had always been the charming one, the smooth talker who coasted on good looks and family name, and the kind of effortless charisma that made people want to be near him. While Emily buried herself in business school, and then in spreadsheets and strategy sessions that lasted until dawn, Daniel threw parties in expensive clubs and cultivated connections with people Emily would never trust, people whose smiles never reached their eyes. When their father died 3 years ago, of a heart attack that surprised no one who had known his lifestyle, the will had been painfully clear. Emily received controlling interest in the company, 51% of shares that gave her ultimate authority. Daniel received a generous trust fund, enough money to live comfortably for several lifetimes, and a seat on the board he rarely attended and seemed to view as a joke. The resentment festered quietly, for years, hidden beneath Daniel's practiced charm and easy smiles. Emily barely noticed, too busy building something that mattered, proving to a world that had underestimated her at every turn that she was more than just a name or a pretty face or her father's daughter. She worked 18-hour days, slept in her office more often than her penthouse apartment that overlooked Central Park, and told herself that loneliness was just the price of greatness, that she would have time for relationships and happiness later, after she had proven herself beyond any doubt. Then came the threats, subtle at first, anonymous at first, messages left on her private line by voices disguised by electronic distortion, emails routed through untraceable servers that bounced across continents. They started vague, warnings to step down, to sell her shares, to walk away while she still could. She ignored them, hired additional security, kept working. The threats escalated in specificity and malice. Photos of her leaving the office, time-stamped and detailed, showing she was being watched constantly. Notes describing her daily routine with chilling accuracy. What she ate for breakfast, which route she took to meetings, when she exercised at the gym. Someone was watching, and they were getting bolder. 2 weeks before Jake found her in the woods, Emily had discovered something that changed everything, that transformed vague suspicions into concrete horror. Financial records buried deep in company accounts, hidden behind layers of shell corporations and offshore trusts. Money flowing in directions that made no legal sense to anyone who understood the business. Someone was embezzling, siphoning millions through carefully constructed networks designed to avoid detection. And the more she traced the threads, the more they all led back to one person. Her brother. Her own blood. She had confronted him in her office, security standing by outside the frosted glass doors, evidence laid out in neat stacks of printouts and highlighted bank transfers. Daniel had smiled, that easy charm, never wavering, even as she detailed his crimes, and told her she was paranoid, seeing conspiracies where none existed. But his eyes had been cold, calculating, and she saw something in them that made her blood run cold. He was measuring her, deciding whether she was a threat that could be managed, or one that needed to be eliminated. She had given him 24 hours to explain himself, or she would go to the authorities with everything she had found. He had not needed 24 hours to make his decision. They came for her on a Thursday night, Three men in black masks as she left the office late. Later than usual, because she had been on calls with lawyers trying to figure out her next move. They moved with military precision, clearly professionals who had done this before. Hands over her mouth before she could scream, something sharp pressed into her neck that burned and made the world spin. The last thing she remembered was being shoved into a van that smelled of motor oil and fear. When she woke, she was in that same van, but now it was moving. Hands bound behind her back with zip ties that cut into her wrists. Tape over her mouth, a hood over her head that made it impossible to see or breathe properly. Terror flooded every cell of her body, primal and overwhelming. She tried to scream, but the tape muffled everything. She tried to move, but strong hands held her down. Time became meaningless in the dark, minutes or hours passing in waves of panic and forced calm as she tried to think, to plan, to figure out some way to survive. The men did not speak to her, not once during the entire drive. They drove for what felt like forever, stopping finally somewhere that smelled of pine and earth and cold air. They dragged her out of the van, her legs barely working, and forced her deeper into woods so quiet she could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. The hood came off, and she saw trees, endless trees, and darkness. One of the men handed her a shovel. Her hands bled as they forced her to dig her own grave, nails breaking against rock and root, blisters forming and popping. When the hole was deep enough, roughly 6 feet long and 4 feet deep, they pushed her in. She fought, screaming against the tape. But they were stronger, and there were 3 of them. They covered her with dirt, not enough to kill her immediately, just enough to trap her, to make escape impossible. A slow death, suffocation and despair, alone in the dark with nothing but her own racing thoughts. One of them had leaned close before they left, his breath hot against her ear, and whispered words that confirmed her worst fears. "Your brother says goodbye. Says this is just business." She had tried to scream, tried to claw her way out. But the earth was heavy, and her strength was fading fast. Hours passed. Or maybe days. Time losing all meaning in the dark. She prayed to gods she did not believe in, bargained with the universe for just one more chance. She thought of all the things she would never do, places she would never see, the family she would never have. She thought about how her last conversation with Daniel had been an accusation, how she had spent her whole life building a company instead of a life. And then, impossibly, miraculously, she felt hands pulling her up, light flooding her vision like the sun breaking through storm clouds, and a man's voice saying words she could not quite hear over the roaring in her ears. Jake had not meant to be a hero. He had been gathering firewood, nothing more, thinking about what to make Lily for dinner and whether he remembered to pay the electric bill. But Rex had found Emily, and instinct had taken over, years of training kicking in without conscious thought. He cleared her airway with shaking hands, checked her pulse with 2 fingers on her cold neck, wrapped her in his jacket even though the cold was biting through his own shirt and making his teeth chatter. She was barely conscious, mumbling words he could not make out, her body shaking violently with hypothermia and shock. He lifted her as carefully as he could, surprised by how light she felt, almost insubstantial, and carried her through the darkening woods toward his truck parked on the logging road a 1/4 mile away. Rex ran ahead, barking to clear the path, occasionally looking back to make sure Jake was following. Every few steps, Jake checked to make sure she was still breathing, still alive, terrified that he had pulled her from the ground only to lose her anyway. He did not know who she was yet, had no idea of the storm he was walking into. Just a woman who had been left to die. And he had found her in time. Barely. By the time he reached the cabin, night had fully fallen, and the temperature was dropping fast. Lily was inside, reading by lamplight at the kitchen table, her homework spread out around her, and her eyes went wide with shock when she saw her father carrying a stranger through the door. Jake laid Emily on the couch as gently as he could, grabbed every blanket in the house, started a fire in the fireplace that caught quickly, and began to fill the room with blessed heat. He cleaned the dirt from her face as gently as he could with a warm washcloth. checked for broken bones with careful hands that had done this 100 times in his firefighting days, tried to assess the damage without hurting her further. Emily's eyes opened, clearer now, focusing on his face with an intensity that startled him. She looked terrified, confused, her lips forming words that came out as barely a whisper. He's my brother. Don't trust anyone." Then her eyes rolled back, and she was unconscious again, her head lolling against the pillow. Jake stood frozen, her words echoing in his mind like a bell that would not stop ringing. He looked at Lily, who was watching from the doorway with wide, worried eyes that reminded him so much of Sarah it hurt. "Call 911, he told her, reaching for his phone. But even as he said it, doubt crept in like smoke. Don't trust anyone. What did that mean? Was she in danger from the police? From hospitals? Was this paranoia? Or was she right? He compromised, calling his old friend Marcus instead, a paramedic who lived 20 minutes away and owed him favors from their time in the service together. Marcus arrived within half an hour, medical bag in hand, asking no questions that Jake could not answer. Together, they stabilized Emily, got fluids into her through an IV line Marcus had brought, monitored her vitals, which were weak but slowly improving. She was severely dehydrated, hypothermic, had bruises and cuts all over her body, but nothing immediately life-threatening. Whoever had buried her had been careful to make it look like an accident or natural death, not murder. "You need to call the police," Marcus said as he packed up his supplies, giving Jake a look that said he knew something was being left unsaid. "This woman needs a hospital, Jake. Real treatment. I can only do so much." Jake nodded, but something held him back, some instinct he could not explain. Her words, the fear in her eyes, the way she had looked at him like he was the only solid thing in a world that was trying to kill her. He asked Marcus to give him until morning, just to make sure she was stable enough to move. Marcus reluctantly agreed, made Jake promise he would not do anything stupid, and left with a worried backward glance. Jake sat by the couch, watching Emily sleep fitfully, her face twitching with nightmares he could only imagine. Lily had gone to bed after a dozen questions he had no good answers for, but he knew she would not sleep well, neither would he. Outside, the woods were silent and dark, but Jake had the distinct feeling that they were not alone, that somewhere out there in the trees, someone was watching and waiting. He got up, checked the locks on all the doors and windows, made sure Rex was alert and positioned by the front door. Then he settled into the chair by the fire, his old service weapon from his firefighting days within reach on the side table, and waited for dawn with every sense on high alert. By morning, Emily was awake and attempting to sit up, despite Marcus's instructions to rest. Barely able to hold herself upright, she sat propped against pillows Jake had arranged, wrapped in blankets that made her look smaller and more vulnerable than her reputation suggested. She sipped water Jake had heated over the fire, taking small, careful sips. Her voice was hoarse, every word clearly an effort. But she was determined to talk, to explain before whatever was coming found her again. She told him everything. Her name, her company, her brother, the conspiracy she had uncovered, the embezzlement and betrayal, the men who had buried her alive on her own brother's orders. Jake listened, his expression carefully neutral, but inside his mind was reeling. This was so far beyond his world of firewood and hardware stores that it felt like fiction, like something from a movie. But the terror in her eyes was real. The bruises on her wrists were real. The dirt still under her fingernails was real. When she finished, silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable. Lily watched from the kitchen table, pretending to color in her coloring book, but hanging on every word. Jake could see the wheels turning in his daughter's head, questions forming that he would have to answer later. "Why not go to the police?" Jake finally asked, the obvious question. Emily's laugh was bitter, almost a bark. "Daniel has connections everywhere, police, judges, politicians, business partners in law enforcement. If I go public without ironclad proof, without something that cannot be denied or buried, I disappear for real this time. Or worse." Her eyes flicked to Lily, then back to Jake, and he understood the unspoken threat. I need time. I need to figure out who I can trust, who is on his payroll, and who is not. I need to gather evidence that is airtight, that cannot be dismissed as the paranoid delusions of a woman who almost died. Jake wanted to tell her this was not his problem, that he had a daughter to protect, a quiet life to preserve, that he had earned his peace and quiet after everything he had lost. But he looked at Emily, broken and desperate, and barely holding herself together, and saw something of himself in her eyes. The same haunted look he saw in his own mirror every morning, when he forced himself to shave and face another day. Two people who had lost too much and were barely holding on, clinging to routine and duty because everything else had been stripped away. You can stay here tonight, he said finally, the words coming out before he could stop them. Tomorrow, we figure out what comes next. But I am not promising anything beyond that. My daughter comes first. Emily nodded, relief washing over her face so completely that he thought she might cry. She closed her eyes, exhaustion pulling her under again like a tide. Jake stood, walked to the window, and stared out at the forest that suddenly felt less like sanctuary and more like a cage. He had pulled her from the ground, saved her life, but he had a sinking feeling that was only the beginning, that whatever darkness had tried to bury Emily Carter was far from finished with her. And he was right. They came that night just after midnight. Jake woke to Rex's growling, a low, continuous rumble that meant immediate danger, not just wildlife. He was on his feet instantly, years of training making his movements automatic. Grabbing his weapon from the nightstand, moving to the window in his bedroom. Two figures, maybe three, moving through the trees toward the cabin with the careful precision of professionals. Armed, judging by their silhouettes, and wearing what looked like tactical gear. He woke Emily first, a hand over her mouth to keep her quiet, whispering urgently. Her eyes snapped open, instantly awake and terrified. Then he went to Lily's room, scooped her up still half asleep, her favorite stuffed bear clutched in her arms. Get to the basement, he whispered to both of them. Stay quiet, no matter what you hear, no matter what. Emily's eyes went wide with understanding, all the color draining from her face. They found me. Go. Now. He watched them disappear down the narrow stairs into the basement, Emily carrying Lily, who was now fully awake and scared, then positioned himself by the front door. His heart was racing, adrenaline flooding his system, but his hands were steady on the grip of his weapon. Training from years of running into burning buildings kicked in automatically. Stay calm. Assess the situation. Act decisively. The first man tried the door, found it locked, stepped back, and said something into a radio Jake could not hear. Jake could see him through the window, masked, communicating with hand signals to his partner who was circling around the side of the cabin. They were preparing to breach, probably had done this dozens of times before. Jake made a split-second decision born from desperation and protective fury. He could not let them get inside, could not risk Lily getting caught in whatever was about to happen. He threw open the door and fired a warning shot into the air, the sound deafening in the quiet night. Federal property, he shouted, bluffing with everything he had. Leave now, or I call backup. You have 10 seconds. The men froze, clearly not expecting resistance, then scattered into the trees like shadows. But Jake knew they would not go far, would regroup and come back with a different approach. He grabbed his truck keys, ran to the basement. We're leaving. Right now. Move. They piled into his old pickup, Emily and Lily in the back seat wrapped in blankets, Rex in the truck bed standing alert, and Jake gunned the engine. Headlights appeared behind them almost immediately, following at a distance but clearly tracking them. Jake took back roads, paths he knew from years of exploring these woods, his truck rattling over rough terrain that would destroy a normal vehicle. Behind them, the pursuit continued, relentless and professional. He took a sharp turn onto a logging trail, killed the lights, and drove blind using only memory and the faint moonlight filtering through the trees. His hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel, every muscle tense. The followers shot past the turnoff, confused, their headlights sweeping uselessly. Jake waited, counting heartbeats, then turned back toward town, toward people and witnesses and safety in numbers. By the time they reached the main highway, the sun was rising, and they had lost their tail, at least for now. They ended up at a motel 30 miles away. One of those roadside places that ask no questions if you paid cash. Jake got them a room on the ground floor, near the exits, with a clear view of the parking lot. Inside, Lily curled up on one bed, exhausted and frightened, clutching her bear. Emily sat on the other bed, shaking despite the warmth of the room. Jake stood by the window, watching the parking lot through a gap in the curtains, his weapon within easy reach. "I'm sorry," Emily said quietly after a long silence. "I brought this to your door. I should leave, find somewhere else, keep you and Lily out of danger." "And go where?" Jake asked without turning, his voice harder than he intended. "They know you're alive now. They'll hunt you until you're not. Until you're buried so deep no one can find you. So what do we do?" Jake finally looked at her, really looked at her, saw past the CEO and the wealth and the power to the terrified woman who had almost died alone in the dark. "We stop running, we fight back. But we do it smart." Emily stared at him, surprise, and something else flickering across her face. Hope, maybe. Or the beginning of trust. "You don't owe me anything. You saved my life. That's already more than I had any right to expect." "No," Jake agreed, sitting down on the edge of Lily's bed, smoothing her hair back from her face as she slept. "But my daughter is in danger now because of this. That makes it my problem, and I am not very good at walking away from problems anymore." Over the next days, an unlikely alliance formed between three people who had no business being together. Emily used contacts she still trusted to gather evidence remotely, accessing encrypted files through anonymous servers, building a case against Daniel Brick by Digital Brick. Jake kept them moving, never staying in one place for more than a day, teaching both Emily and Lily basic security measures he had learned in the service. Check every exit. Trust your instincts. Never establish patterns. Lily, for her part, adapted with the frightening resilience of children, treating it like an adventure even though Jake could see the fear hiding behind her brave face, but could hear it in the way she clung to him at night. Emily watched Jake with his daughter. The gentle patience even when exhausted, the fierce protectiveness that never wavered. The way he made her laugh even when they were living out of a truck and felt something crack open inside her chest. She had built her entire life around power and control and independence, convinced that needing anyone was weakness, that vulnerability was something to be eliminated like a bad investment. But watching this man who barely knew her risk everything for strangers made her question every choice she had made, every wall she had built. One night, sitting outside their latest motel while Lily slept inside, Emily finally asked the question that had been nagging at her. "Why are you really doing this? You could have called the police that first night, handed me over. Gone back to your life. Why did you believe me?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring at the stars that were clearer out here than they ever were in the city. "5 years ago, I watched someone I loved die and couldn't do anything to stop it. Every single day since, I've wondered if I could have done something different. Been faster, better, more alert. When I found you in those woods, it felt like maybe I was getting a second chance. To save someone, to matter again, to be the person I used to be before everything fell apart." He looked at her, his eyes reflecting the dim light from the motel sign. "Maybe that's selfish. Maybe I am doing this for me, as much as for you." "No," Emily said softly, and meant it. "It's human. It's more human than anything I have done in years." She told him about her own loneliness then, words spilling out that she had never said to anyone. About the empire she had built to fill the hollow place inside where family and love should have been. About sacrificing every soft thing to prove she was strong enough, only to realize too late that strength without connection was just another kind of prison. They talked until dawn. two damaged people finding unexpected understanding in each other. Sharing wounds they usually kept hidden. When they finally went back inside, something had shifted between them, a connection forming that neither could quite name, but both felt like a lifeline. But there was no time for whatever was growing between them to develop naturally. Daniel had realized Emily was not only alive, but actively building a case against him. He escalated dramatically. The threats became more direct, more violent. A bomb threat at a courthouse where Emily's lawyers were meeting. Forcing an evacuation. An attempt to grab Lily from a gas station while Jake was paying inside, that Jake barely thwarted by running out and physically fighting off the would-be kidnapper. They were running out of places to hide and time to prepare. Emily made the hard choice after the attempt on Lily. We need to draw him out. Use me as bait. End this before someone gets killed. Absolutely not, Jake said immediately, his voice harder than she had ever heard it. That's not a plan. That's suicide. It's the only way. He wants me dead. Needs me dead to secure his control. Let's give him a chance, but on our terms, with proof, with witnesses, with everything we need to end him permanently. They argued for hours, voices rising and falling, Lily listening from the other room with wide, frightened eyes. But Emily was right and Jake knew it, hated that she was right. Finally, he agreed. On the condition that he controlled every variable, that Lily was somewhere safe with Marcus, that Emily wore a wire and had police backup close but not so close that Daniel would spot them. They planned meticulously, using Emily's knowledge of Daniel's patterns and Jake's tactical training from firefighting, where you learn to think 3 moves ahead or people died. The trap was set for a warehouse on the outskirts of Richmond. Neutral ground that Emily convinced Daniel she had chosen for a secret meeting. She claimed she wanted to negotiate, to offer him a deal to walk away with his trust fund intact if he left her and the company alone. Daniel agreed too easily, too eager, too confident. He thought he held all the cards, had no idea the game had changed. Jake positioned himself in the rafters with a clear line of sight to the main floor. Police on standby a block away with strict orders not to move until Jake gave the signal. Emily wore a wire, her phone recording everything, backup devices hidden in her clothes in case the first was found. Lily was with Marcus 50 miles away, safe and far from whatever was about to happen. Everything was in place. It had to work. Daniel arrived exactly on time with 2 men Jake recognized from the night they had attacked his cabin, the same professional coldness in their movements. He smiled when he saw Emily standing alone in the center of the empty warehouse, that charming mask he wore so well. "Sister, you look surprisingly good for someone who should be dead and buried in the woods. You tried to bury me alive," Emily said, her voice steady despite the fear Jake could see in the set of her shoulders. "Your own sister." "Business," Daniel said with a shrug, so casual it was obscene. "Nothing personal. You were always too rigid, too moral, too much like Dad with his outdated ideas. The company deserved someone willing to do what needed to be done, to make the hard choices. Like embezzle millions? Like murder your own sister?" Daniel's smile never wavered. And that was somehow more frightening than anger would have been. "Murder is such an ugly word, Emily. I prefer strategic removal of obstacles. And yes, I took money. I earned it. You got everything handed to you, the company, the control, the respect, Dad's approval. I got scraps and patronizing pats on the head, so I took what should have been mine all along." Jake watched from above, recording every word, his finger on the trigger of his phone to signal the police. This was it, the confession they needed, clear and unambiguous. He sent the signal, but Daniel was not stupid, had not survived this long by being careless. He had seen through the trap, had his own people watching the police. His men drew weapons, grabbed Emily before she could move. "Did you really think I would just confess?" Daniel laughed, the sound echoing in the empty space. "Give me some credit. You're coming with me, dear sister, and this time, I'll make sure the job gets finished properly. No shallow graves." Just gone. Jake did not think, just acted on instinct and training. He dropped from the rafters, landing hard on the concrete floor. His body screaming in protest, but adrenaline overriding pain. He tackled the nearest man, used his momentum to disarm him, threw him into the second attacker, with a force that sent both sprawling. Daniel grabbed Emily, producing a gun from his jacket, pressing it to her head as he backed toward the exit. "Stay back," Daniel shouted, his composure finally cracking, showing the desperation underneath. "I will kill her. I swear I'll do it." Jake raised his hands, stepping forward slowly, carefully. "You don't want to do this. Police are already here. It's over. You can't run from this. It's not over until I say it's over." Daniel's finger tightened on the trigger, and Jake saw Emily close her eyes, preparing for the end. But Emily was not finished fighting. Years of self-defense training kicked in. Muscle memory, overriding fear and resignation. She twisted suddenly, knocked the gun aside with one hand, threw her elbow back into Daniel's face with every ounce of strength she had left. He stumbled, blood streaming from his nose, and Jake was there instantly, tackling him to the ground. The gun skittered away across the concrete. Sirens wailed outside, growing rapidly louder. Police burst through the doors, weapons drawn, shouting orders that echoed off the walls. Daniel Carter was arrested along with his accomplices, hands cuffed behind his back as he shouted about lawyers and false accusations that no one was listening to. The recording was clear, his confession ironclad, witnessed and documented. Within hours, the story broke nationally. The CEO who survived being buried alive, the conspiracy that nearly succeeded. The brother who had tried to kill her for power and money and wounded pride. Emily's name was everywhere again. But this time, as a survivor, a fighter. Someone who had faced death and come back stronger. Jake stood outside the warehouse, watching Emily give statements to detectives, cameras flashing in the distance like lightning. She looked exhausted but unbroken. Stronger somehow than when he had pulled her from the ground. She caught his eye across the chaos and smiled, a real smile, and Jake felt something in his chest loosen, a weight he had been carrying for 5 years finally beginning to lift. Lily ran to him from Marcus's car the moment she saw him, throwing herself into his arms with a force that nearly knocked him over. He held her tight, breathing in the scent of her hair, grounding himself in her solid reality. They had survived. Against impossible odds, against people with money and power and connections, they had survived. And more than that, they had won. In the days that followed, Emily returned to New York, to her company, to the life she had built. The media circus was overwhelming, every network wanting interviews. Her face on every magazine cover, but she handled it with grace, giving carefully scripted interviews, rebuilding trust with shareholders, restructuring leadership to eliminate any remaining conspirators. Daniel was charged with attempted murder, embezzlement, conspiracy, and a dozen other crimes. He would spend decades in prison, his charm and connections finally worthless. Jake returned to his cabin, to his quiet life that suddenly felt too quiet. But it did not feel the same anymore. The silence that had once been comforting now felt empty, like something was missing. Lily asked about Emily constantly, when they would see her again, if she was okay, if they were still friends. Jake did not have answers, told himself it was better this way, that their worlds were too different, that what they had shared was just adrenaline and survival, not anything real or lasting. 3 weeks after the arrest, a car pulled up the long drive to the cabin, expensive and out of place among the trees. Jake watched from the porch, Rex at his side. As the door opened and Emily stepped out, she was dressed simply in jeans and a sweater that looked new, her hair loose around her shoulders instead of the severe bun she wore in all her professional photos. She looked nervous, uncertain. So different from the powerful CEO, the world knew. She walked up to the porch slowly, stopped at the bottom of the stairs. "Hi." "Hi," Jake said, his heart doing something complicated in his chest. "I couldn't stop thinking about you. Either of you." She looked past him to where Lily was peeking through the screen door. I built this whole life around being independent, around not needing anyone, around being strong enough alone. And then a stranger pulled me from the ground and showed me what I had been missing. Showed me that strength can mean letting people in, not keeping them out. Jake came down the stairs, stood close enough to see the hope and fear warring in her eyes. "What are you saying, Emily?" She smiled, that same real smile from the warehouse, the one that reached her eyes. "I'm saying this time, let's not be alone. I'm saying, I want to try. I'm saying you and Lily, you saved me in more ways than just pulling me from the dirt. I'm saying I have an empire in New York, but it means nothing if I'm living it alone." Lily burst through the door, wrapping her arms around Emily's waist with the uncomplicated joy of children. Emily laughed, surprised, then hugged her back, fierce and tight. Over Lily's head, she met Jake's eyes, questioning. He reached out, his calloused hand finding hers, and squeezed gently. A promise without words. They stood there in the fading afternoon light. Three people who had been broken by loss and violence and betrayal, finding something unexpected in each other. A second chance. A new beginning. Proof that sometimes the worst moments lead to the best ones. That family is not just blood, but choice and commitment. And that trust, once earned through fire, can heal even the deepest wounds. The woods stretched out around them, dark and deep, but no longer threatening. Just trees and earth, and the whisper of wind through branches, the promise of tomorrow. Inside the cabin, a fire waited to be lit, dinner to be made, a life to be built together from pieces that had seemed too broken to mend. It would not be easy. Emily's world and Jake's were still oceans apart in many ways. But they had survived the impossible together. They could figure out the rest. Rex barked once, happy, and they all turned toward the door. Home. For the first time in years, for both Jake and Emily, it felt like more than just a place or a building or an escape. It felt like a destination worth reaching. A future worth believing in. People worth fighting for. And in the gathering dusk, as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, three souls who had almost been lost forever walked inside together, closing the door on the past and opening it to a future they would write themselves, one day at a time, with courage and hope and love that had been earned the hardest way possible.